Church. Thanks for joining us this morning, for tuning in. We're so glad that you did. Let's worship together today, giving God all the praise and glory, for He alone is worthy. Sing it out. Salvation sounds a new beginning. As distant hearts begin believing. Redemption's bid is unrelenting. Your love goes on. Your love goes on. You carry on when the world gives way. You cover us with your endless grace. Love is relentless. Your love is relentless. The time is up for chasing shadows. Gave the world a light to follow. A hope that shines beyond tomorrow. Your love goes on. Your love goes on. You carry us when the world gives way. You cover us with your endless grace. Love is relentless. Your love is relentless. Your love is relentless. Your love is relentless. Tearing through the veil of darkness, breaking every chain, you set us free. Fighting for the furthest heart, you gave your life for all to see. Tearing through the veil of darkness, breaking every chain, you set us free. Fighting for the furthest heart, you gave your life. Your love is relentless. Your love is relentless. Your love is relentless. Your love is
Hey there, Ocean Point. Thanks for tuning in again to our online service. I want to pick up with where we were last week. And if you weren't a part of our lesson last week, I'll kind of just do a quick little synopsis. And what we talked about in part was there's this idea, this concept that seems almost irrational when it comes to Christians, when it comes to our faith, that maybe those from the outside looking in might not be able to make sense of it, and maybe you as a believer might not be able to make sense of it either. And it's just this, it's that we turn to God when bad things happen, even when we believe that He could have kept them from happening in the first place, right? That doesn't seem to make sense, because if we believe that He can stop it now, we believe that He could have stopped it before. And why didn't He stop it before? If He could have stopped it before, but He didn't stop it before, so we're going to reach out to Him now. And it can seem to create this conflict of faith, this conflict of rationale, of what do we say, what do we believe, what do we do? And so last week we looked to the early church. We looked to one of the early church leaders, Peter, to see exactly how the early church behaved and what they did and how they responded to, quite honestly, things that are worse than most of us will ever even imagine or come to experience in our lives. And their response was the same, that they would turn to God even when things didn't seem to be adding up. So we're going to look back at that a little bit more, and we're going to really look at this characteristic of the early church, that even in the light of disaster, when disaster struck, when there was famine, when there was disease, when there was persecution, they would still turn to God. And one of the incredible things that they would do is this too. They wouldn't just turn to God, but they would look to see how they could help others who were most impacted by the disaster. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, even more so next week. And the key underlying inspiring piece for me that I see from the early church is this. They maintained hope even when they didn't have explanations. Have you found yourself in a time in your life, maybe it's a personal struggle, maybe it's something to do with what's happened in the past year, where you've been scratching your head and trying to figure out, what do you do? How do you make sense of something? And maybe it's caused you to doubt. See, the early church, they were facing a struggle and a persecution unlike anything we can imagine, and yet they still maintained a faith, because they believed that an easy life, that things working out well for them, was not evidence of there being a God or not being a God. It wasn't about that. And it wasn't because they were crazy or delusional or superstitious. And it was because, see, their leader, Peter, he assured them that their hope was not in vain, because their hope was anchored to an event, the resurrection of Jesus. And Peter had clout. Like, Peter had this ability to speak truth into this, and they believed him, they listened to him because he saw that. His life was this representation of change. It was this testimony to see that this was truly something that happened. He was an eyewitness to both the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. So his words, they carried a ton of weight. So in the midst of natural disasters, political upheaval, religious persecution, and just another day in not paradise for early Christians, first century Christians, their death-defying confidence in God, which was fueled by Peter's teachings. It's why there is no Roman Empire today, but there are churches in almost every major and minor city throughout the entire globe. Their faith and their confidence in the midst of everything that they experienced is what enabled the church to continue to move forward, and enabled the church to ultimately topple the Roman Empire. Not that was their design, and not that was their intent of, hey, if we do this, if we love, if we maintain, then maybe we'll overthrow the Roman Empire. It wasn't that idea. It's just that's what ultimately came from it. So we left off last week with James, the brother of John, not James, brother of Jesus. He was executed by Herod. This Herod is the grandson of the Herod that we read about in the birth story of Jesus. And the crowd, they loved it. They went wild. And so they just wanted more Christian blood. So Herod, he goes and he arrests Peter. He's the top of the list of who you're looking for to be able to try to find in regards to this new movement, this what they thought of as a cult, these Christians. So he arrests Peter, but before he can execute him, something miraculous happens. And Peter is miraculously led out of and escapes that prison cell. And Peter goes to a prayer gathering at the home of a woman named Mary. Now, have you ever just thought, like, if you've read any of the New Testament, or if you've read through the New Testament, or maybe you're just loosely familiar with the Bible and you've just heard different things, doesn't it seem like basically every woman in the Bible is named Mary? And I think this is an interesting fact just to touch on just for a moment, because if the Bible was written by people who were just trying to make up a story, you wouldn't use the same name for multiple characters. How confusing would that be if you named half your characters the same name? But what we know from history is that Mary was the most popular name of women in that time, which also I think lends credibility to the historicity and the accuracy and the trustability of the New Testament. Because if someone was writing these letters a few hundred years later in another part of the world, they wouldn't have known that. But it's true, and that's what happened. And the reason why this name repeats itself, even though it might be a little bit confusing, is because that's the actual name of the women who we encounter in these stories. So they go to, or Peter arrives at this prayer gathering at the house of a woman named Mary. And he decides that he is going to leave so that she doesn't get in trouble, so he doesn't endanger any of them. The last thing that we read really kind of as he gets ready to depart is found in Acts chapter 12, verse 17. And it says this: "Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this," he said. And then he left for another place. Where did he go? We don't know where he went. No one knows where he went. He had a price on his head, and he was on the run. The Roman Empire searching for him, looking for him. And what we know is that he lived his life on the run for about 8 years. He eventually does make his way back to Rome. And along the way, he dictates some of his memories of the life and the teachings of Jesus to a man named John Mark. Now, John Mark is the son of the Mary who's hosting the prayer gathering. So they're there together. And I'm trying to put myself into the head of this Mary, whose son is John Mark and is there. Peter arrives, and this is an incredible thing that's happened, this incredible miracle. And they know that Peter has to leave, though, because if he stays too long, they're going to find him. They'll execute him. He is a wanted man. And her son says, "Hey, Mom, can I go with him? Can I go with the person who has a bounty, the person who they're looking to find and kill? Can I go with them?" I wonder what Mary thought about that. Either way, this is what John Mark does, and they go together, and Peter's exploits and his stories and things of what he saw and witnessed with Jesus are eventually recorded in what we would call the book of Mark, so that we can see and know those things that happened. And now, while we don't know a ton of what happened during this time, what we do know is that while Peter was on the run, he dictated at least 2 letters to someone else as they were written. And we refer to them as 1st and 2nd Peter. The first letter of Peter, the second letter of Peter. And they're found in our New Testament. And they were written to Christians. They were written to Christ followers of the time. And these are Christians who had been scattered throughout the entire Roman Empire because of persecution. These were house churches that were led by Christians that were popping up all over the place, all over the empire. And people in the empire, they didn't quite know what to make of them, because these people, they weren't Jewish, but they weren't pagan, right? They worshiped the Jewish God, but on the wrong day of the week. They were good citizens, but they weren't kosher. They formed their own communities, but they weren't exclusive. They weren't elitists. They invited others in, and they went out of their way to take care of people that nobody else took care of. But here's the sticking point. The sticking point for the Roman Empire was this. They would not sacrifice to or acknowledge local deities or local gods. And that was a problem. In ancient times, adding a god to your list of your pantheon, to your list of gods, wasn't that big of a deal, wasn't all that uncommon. But to not acknowledge a God that is in place was extremely problematic, because fundamental to the Roman religion was the assumption that Rome was eternal as long as Rome enjoyed favor with the gods. And their gods were infamously fickle and they were easily offended. I feel like they would fit right in with our culture and our world today. If they had their own Twitter account to tweet out different things about what they're offended about. But maintaining the favor of the gods, this was a national security issue. And if too many Roman citizens, if they neglected the gods, and they went and chased after some other gods, some other new god that was on the block, some other new god that was there, it would only be a matter of time before the old gods got angry and they withdrew their favor. So this thinking, it was so tightly woven and embedded into the ancient consciousness, right, of the people in the Roman Empire, that as Christianity spread, locals began blaming Christians for everything, anything negative. Because if something bad happened, it's because these Christians were not worshiping the right gods, and the gods were withdrawing their favor. The gods were extending some sort of punishment towards them. In fact, scapegoating Christians was so common that Tertullian, an adult convert to Christianity, and the son of a Roman centurion, he observed this, and this is what's recorded. He writes, if the Tiber rises too high, now the Tiber was a river that, did things like most rivers do, but it was also their means of a sewer system, their sewage. So you can imagine, like, just, if you've ever had like your sewer system back up, we had a time where in our house here where our sewer system backed up, and so into the basement, just all this. Oh, and so if the Tiber rises too high and there's this nastiness everywhere, he says, or the Nile is too low. Now, the Nile River basin, that's where they would get all of their grain. That's where they would purchase those different things. So it was the source of irrigation. And when the Nile ran low, it resulted in a bad harvest and would dry up. And then the grain prices would rise up, and it would trigger civil unrest and famine and all these different kinds of things. All right. So again, he says, so if the Tiber rises too high or the Nile is too low, the remedy is always feeding Christians to the lions. In other words, when anything went wrong, clearly the gods were upset. And the best way to appease the gods was to rid the empire of those who did not recognize the gods. So this put Christians in a very precarious position wherever they lived in the empire. And Peter knew this. So he wrote to Christians throughout the empire to comfort them, to encourage them. And we looked at a portion of what he wrote last week, where he assured them that their suffering was not God's judgment, and they had not done anything wrong. On the contrary, their suffering and their response, these were tools that God used to draw attention to himself. Imagine, right? They probably thought, and we would think, all right, that's great, but I'd rather a different tool, something different to be able to draw attention. Isn't there something else that we could do? And Peter, he writes this in one of those letters that he dictated that we call 1 Peter. In chapter 1, verse 7, he says, these sufferings have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold. So basically just saying, like, if you get this right, there will be no doubt about the genuineness of your faith. These sufferings have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, may result in praise, glory, honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. So this is kind of Peter's version of saying, let your light shine in such a way that people will see your good works, look up, and glorify your Father in heaven. Then he gives these Christ followers, these first century Christians, he gives them something to do while they're navigating the suffering that's coming. It's this, he He's not trying to sugarcoat it. He's saying you are going to experience suffering. And while you are experiencing suffering, here's something that you can look to do. It's kind of if you've ever gone shopping, right? And maybe you're running to the grocery store, you're doing something, and your spouse or your roommate or someone just says, hey, real quick, hey, while you're out, can you, and for some of us, it's like those dreaded words, like, oh, I just want to do this thing. I want to be done. I want to go home. And they're like, can you, while you're, this is hey, while you're out, can you, and so Peter's saying, hey, while you're in the midst of all of this suffering, here are the instructions. And I don't want you to lose focus. I don't want you just to circle your wagons and just lose what is most important. Instead, 1 Peter 4:1, he writes this. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, and since you're Jesus followers, arm yourselves also with. Now, this means equip yourselves with, or go find a particular tool or weapon or item to which then we could say, all right, arm ourselves with what? Right? So if we're worried about what's happening and we're facing this persecution, and Peter's writing, okay, arm yourselves. And you're thinking, okay, what do we arm ourselves with? What kind of tool, what kind of thing do we need to have? He says, arm yourselves with the same attitude. What? He's saying, yeah, arm yourselves, with the same way of thinking and the same perspective as Jesus. In other words, consider Jesus's approach to suffering and ask how you can adopt that same approach. But Peter doesn't leave it to us to figure out what that looks like. He spells it out, all right? In verses 8 through 10, he says, above all, all right, above everything else, above all, this is the number one priority. And what comes next, it shouldn't surprise us coming from Peter, because he was there the night that Jesus established this command that replaced all the other commands. He was there when Jesus gave them their marching orders and ours. So here's what Peter says to do. Verse 8. Love each other deeply, in an unwavering way, in a deeply earnest way. He continues, he says, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. This point was this: sin will divide you. Love will unite you. Sin will divide you and love will unite you. You can't afford to be divided. People are watching, and you need each other more than any other time. And especially in times of suffering. So while you're being mistreated, love each other deeply. While you are suffering, love each other deeply. Do not let anything divide you. It's when we are suffering, it's when we are facing things that are pulling us apart, that we can sometimes retreat into the darkness, that we can retreat into ourselves, that we can retreat into just self-preservation. I just want what's best for me. I only want to be able to take care of me. I only want to watch out for me. And it's at those times that it's most important that we love deeply, that we look to others. Because that's our biggest opportunity. To demonstrate that there's a difference in the hope and the faith that we have, that our hope is found in something else other than this world. That for us, those of us who are Jesus followers, death is not something to be afraid of. And so we behave differently. This is an opportunity that others can look and just maybe scratch their heads as to, like, I don't understand. I don't get it. How? How do you navigate like this? And it's an incredible opportunity for others to look and to see. so that we can be this oasis in the middle of a time of uncertainty and chaos and instability, that to our neighbors, to our coworkers, to our roommates, to the other students around us, that they can look to us and see that sense of peace and that sense of calm. Maybe you've experienced this where you've seen someone or something that they experienced something in life, some sort of tragedy, something horrific that happened, and yet their faith remained strong and they were able to show something different in their life. And you look at them, and to you just think, what? How is that possible? And it invigorates your own faith in seeing that. Church, this is our opportunity. As it seems like every day the world gets more and more uncertain, that gives us more and more opportunity to demonstrate a hope and a peace, that we can be that oasis of mercy and compassion, that we can implement into our culture. Those ideas seem maybe normal for us, but those concepts, they were brand new to the early church. And they extended this grace and this compassion to the very people who would ignore them. As there were epidemics that went throughout the lands, you know who the ones were that would take care of the sick, the unlovables? It was the Christians. They would take care of their neighbor who maybe the day before wouldn't even acknowledge their existence. And so these brave first century Christians, this is what they did. They acted on what they believed. They did something versus just being. It was this idea that they would give of themselves, that they would serve others, and that they would love. And I want that to be us, that we should be marked in such a way that people should see us and know that there is something different, that we as a church, we would be known as different because we are irrational in our generosity. We are irrational in our serving. We are irrational in our loving. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about something that we discussed amongst our staff this next week. And the details aren't ironed out yet, so I can't share it with you yet, but I'm really excited because we are going to have an incredible opportunity to do something for our community, to do something where it's not like, hey, we're going to do this because we want to be able to get something back. We want to do something because we believe that we have been inspired, that God has loved us, so we are going to love you, that we want to be this oasis of grace and mercy in the midst of a world of chaos. So we've got something really cool planned. I can't wait to share it with you. So make sure that you watch the next couple of weeks. Make sure that you stay tuned with us as we continue this journey together, so that we can be a church. So we can be a gathering that's not even able to gather, but a gathering of Jesus followers who are able to transform and change our community, that we're able to demonstrate to our community what is different about us, and that there is something bigger than the uncertainty in the world. Because when the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, that is our opportunity.
presence. No mortal man would dare to stand before your throne, before the Holy One of heaven. And it's only by your blood, and it's only through your mercy, Lord, I come. I bring an offering of worship to my King. No one on earth deserves the praises that I sing. Jesus, may you receive the honor that's your due. Oh Lord, I bring an offering to you. The sun cannot compare. The sun cannot compare to the glory of your love. There is no shadow in your presence. No mortal man would dare to stand before your throne, before the Holy One of heaven. And it's only by your blood, and it's only through your mercy, Lord, I come. I bring an offering of worship to my King. No one on earth deserves the praises that I sing. Jesus, may you receive the honor that's your due. Oh Lord, I bring an offering to you. Sing again. I bring an offering of worship to my King. No one on earth deserves the praises that I sing. Jesus, may you receive the honor that's your due. Oh Lord, I bring an offering to you. Oh Lord, I bring an offering to you. I bring an offering. Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down and fights till I'm bound, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sing it out, church. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. you won't climb, mountain you won't climb, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Snow shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Sing it. Snow shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Yeah. Snow shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending greatness of God. Oh, it chases me down and finds till I'm done. He's the night God. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending greatness of God. Oh God, we thank you so much for your reckless love towards us. God, thank you so much for humbling yourself and giving us your Son, Jesus. Somebody to exemplify, somebody to follow. Lord, we thank you so much for his love towards us. God, be with us in this coming week. Help us to humble ourselves. Help us to take on our cross and follow him.